I'm Alex Smith, I'm Regional Analyst here at Intelligence Fusion, and I'm going to be talking about the coup in Myanmar. So on the morning of February the 1st, the Myanmar military, called the Tatmadaw, seized power from the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy, or NLD party. So in terms of motivations for the coup, the military have always been in control of Myanmar. Most recently thanks to the 2008 constitution that granted them the power to appoint a lot of officials. They had more appointed members of parliament than elected. This was sort of threatened in November of last year when the general election returned 83% of the vote for the NLD. And I think the generals really saw the prospect of a second term with Aung San Suu Kyi at the head of a civilian government as kind of a threat to their entrenched power, and would have really undermined their authority. So rather than risk that, they decided to stage a coup and take control. They claimed, they've made unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud, irregularities, that sort of thing. The chance of that happening are pretty slim. And they use that as justification to move in and take power. Aung San Suu Kyi is now in prison, along with some other leading NLD figures, and the military is taking control of the country. In terms of reactions, there were a lot of protests, street movements, demonstrations. As you can imagine, 83% of the population had just had their government thrown out by the military. Big protests certainly in the major cities, but really dotted all over the place, of varying scale. The military responded, as you might expect them to respond, pretty brutally with tear gas, rubber bullets, beatings, quite a few instances of live ammunition being used on protesters. Unclear how many were killed. But for example, one incident in Bago in sort of early April, they killed 80 plus civilians when they opened up on the demonstration there. Once the protests sort of were up and running, a lot of sectors of society also started going on strike, formulated into what's known as the civil disobedience movement. So they kind of crippled the country, sort of teachers' unions, transport workers, medical professionals, everything basically shut down in protest against the junta. Junta have tried intimidation and all sorts to keep people going to work, although it's not really had an effect. In terms of resistance, it has shifted towards more of an armed resistance. There's still a lot of protests going on, sort of they're ubiquitous around the country, pretty much every day, well disseminated on social media, but they're on much smaller scale. They seem to be sort of few people, few signs, photo op, because they've met with such brutal crackdowns from the military. What we did start seeing around sort of April, May, a lot of the young people in response to these crackdowns went and found sanctuary with some of the ethnic armed groups which have patchwork of territory sitting around the perimeter around Myanmar's borders and the highlands. A lot of them went to train and get military instruction and training from these ethnic armed groups in like Shan State and Kachin particularly. And then from that formed what are known as People's Defence Forces, or PDFs. These are sort of localised resistance groups that have been carrying out sort of guerrilla tactic attacks on junta forces, certainly in the rural areas and in the cities, carrying out quite a sort of terrorist campaign. There's been a lot of IEDs, lots of bombings targeting mainly sort of police in the cities. There have been a lot of assassinations carried out, normally shootings, against figures associated with the junta, whether they're from the sort of pro-military USDP party, whether they're pro-military militias that have also formed as an effort to repress the democracy movement, or if they're sort of local officials that are in some way associated with them or believed to be informants is a classic one. It's difficult to attribute who exactly is carrying these assassinations out, so we generally sort of attribute them to the PDFs rather than the ethnic armed groups who are much more in sort of the hinterlands and the away from the cities. In terms of response to that, it's more of the same. Pretty brutal repression. There have been a number of mass killings, a lot of arbitrary abductions, imprisonments. There's at least 5,000 people have been put in prison. Quite a few instances of them being tortured. There have been a few cases of people dying under torture whilst in detainment. Sometimes their bodies are handed back, sometimes they aren't. Outside of in terms of conflict with the ethnic armed groups, that's escalated a lot. We see frequent use of artillery. There've been use of airstrikes that have caused, especially these artillery and airstrikes have been driving local populations. There's a lot of internally displaced people. Some have fled across borders into Thailand, into India, in the thousands. Some to return, some not. And it's just a war zone, basically. Yeah. As I mentioned, there's humanitarian and refugee concerns. Like I say, thousands have been driven over the border into Thailand. Quite a few thousand have headed into India. There's a broader humanitarian problem. They've been heavily hit by COVID. And as I've described, the state capacity is virtually non-existent, and what junta government there is aren't particularly fussed about providing healthcare to certainly like the ethnically controlled areas. So they've been hit hard by COVID. So yeah, there's the humanitarian and refugee crisis. There's a bit of geopolitics playing out. The US, President Biden, came out in favour of sanctions that could target junta figures and businesses linked with with the junta. Although it's not really clear if that's going to have much of an effect, and not many other countries involved in Myanmar are really jumping on board with that. For instance, Japan and probably to an extent India have business interests in Myanmar, and they see it kind of as a zero-sum game with China. They know that if they pull their investment, then China's just going to step in and they'll lose influence in an important area. So since the coup, we've also seen quite an explosion in the illegal and illicit mining of Myanmar's resources, particularly again in Shan and Kachin states. This mainly done by sort of Chinese businesses, quite unofficially. Rare earth elements are quite common in Myanmar, and they've really moved in, and local sources on the ground have said that the number of lorries shipping minerals into China has gone up 10-15 fold since the coup happened. There's also gold mining in Kachin state that's also being exploited. In terms of prospects, Myanmar's a very, very complicated place, and since the coup, the junta versus democracy elements is almost an overlay to a load of pre-existing conflicts and different interests, so it's hard to predict. The fact is that even combined, the PDFs and all the ethnic armed groups are probably never going to have a military victory over the Tatmadaw, which is in the region of 400,000 men. Barring internal political splits between the generals, I can't really see the Tatmadaw fragmenting. Likewise, I can't really see any foreign intervention. I've already talked about sanctions. China has a non-interference policy. So I don't know if there's really going to be much external pressure put on any parties. There's also the big question of, even if talks were to begin between the National Unity government and the Tatmadaw, if that happened, it's difficult to see what they could possibly agree on. Like, I can't see pro-democracy advocates being willing to just go back to status quo ante before the coup, where the military basically still has all of the power. I think they would probably push for getting rid of the 2008 constitution and having a proper democracy. Likewise, the ethnic armed groups all have their own agendas. And while some of them were signatories to a ceasefire in 2015, some of them weren't, I can't see them being happy to go back to the 2008 sort of constitution. I would expect to see some of them, if not pushing for like full independence, a federalist constitution. In combination, these things kind of make it a zero-sum game for the Tatmadaw. They're not, what can they possibly gain by talking to anyone? So if I were to make a prediction, I can see this conflict just dragging on for a long time. Unfortunately, Myanmar has all the ingredients of a failed state. Not saying that's where it's going to go, but it has the ingredients.